And I'm Liz Moore. I'm co-chair of programs here at the Foundation, Preservation Foundation. And today we have with us Mayor Rummel, who will start us off, Art Miller, and Gunny Harboe, and he is a preservation architect. He's also going to speak today. So welcome and thanks for coming on such a beautiful day. And we'll enjoy our tour of the train station. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. I guess I'm supposed to start this off. It's interesting that this picture is up on the wall because, as I told Art just before we came in, we are celebrating our 100th anniversary of Lake Forest Day this year. And it's going to be quite a celebration. It's going to start on the Thursday before Lake Forest Day and go through the Wednesday after it. One of the requests that we had was to bring this train back to Lake Forest. Unfortunately, this train does exist. But unfortunately, it doesn't fit under any of the underpasses anymore, so they can't get it here. And the second part was that we were rejected because it is rush hour and they would have this train sitting on the track, so it would create quite a mess. But I just wanted to give you a quick history of how important this is to the council. This building, we put a grant in to have the building renovated in 2005. That grant was turned down by the state. At that time, the cost of renovating this building was $3.2 million. And we believe that when we put ourselves in again, it's going to be a little over $3.6 million. We are putting in again to have this building renovated on May 1st of this year. We continue to apply for the grant to have this done, and we're hoping that we'll get 80% of the amount of the money, which would leave somewhere around $700,000 for the city to come out of their budget or donations to come up with to renovate the train station. So this is important. This has been on our mind for the last year because the renovation that was done 25 years ago, which I believe you're going to speak about, Art, took us to point A, but now we are continuing to see further erosion, and we're to the point where we do have to do a major renovation of the train station, and that's what the $3.6 million is. When you look at the square footage, it's about 8,000 to 9,000 square feet. So you can picture that it's about $300 to $400 a square foot to renovate the train station. And that's just to bring it back to its old standard. We've had a number of proposals from the city level as to do things with this. Certainly, we've had a proposal to put a second story on it. We've had a proposal to put another drive-through through it. All of those have been rejected because we wish to keep the train station as it currently is. So that's where we stand today with the city. This is a very important issue on our mind, as is Bennett Hall out at Grove Campus, which is another building that needs about $1 million of renovation. So as we study where we wish to put our money, this is probably our #1 project because it is our most important project in town. So I just wanted to bring you up to date on that, and I'll turn it over to you, Art.
Thank you. I'm going to speak just about some of the early history of the train station and how we got to where it was, why it's significant historically here, and also in the just the evolution of the community and what it means to us here. So I'll start out. There's just a few slides which I'm going to rattle through fairly quickly. Maybe people know this picture, but I put it in for the train, which is, of course, great, and all the railroad enthusiasts here will appreciate the train. But this is an 1860s, perhaps 1860 view of the little depot that was the second train station. There was an earlier, some kind of a hut, I think, that has not, I don't think, been dignified by preservation in a picture. But this is the second building. What's important about this is to understand its relationship to the original plan of the city. And I'll just stand over to this point here to mention, if you'll notice, the wonderful thing about the 1857 street plan is that all the roads converged at the depot, at the train station. We'd picture now being able to drive through on Sheridan Road. You couldn't do that then. There was no Sheridan Road. So the town really rounded out north and south at these ravines, and it didn't really go west of the tracks. Initially, at least. It does now in a few places, but not then. So they converged up here at Illinois Road, Deer Path, and Westminster, and they all came together. Now, that was because the guy, I think partly, who designed the town was a cemetery designer, and they always have a front gate. So it was perfectly logical. Everybody would come to the front gate. And it had a certain aspect of control to it because everyone would come by the train. There were no really roads going anywhere. So you'd arrive at the train station, then you'd fan out into the town plan from there. Not too directly, as we all know, but you'd wind toward wherever your destination was. So that was one of the reasons why the station is so important. It was really literally where everything started and stopped in the town. The businesses were very soon relegated to the other side of the tracks, to Western Avenue, and so it was only residential on the east side of the tracks. So that by the mid-1860s, there had been a couple little shoe parlor and another little store clustered kind of on McKinley, but they were moved over. So this is, my theory is this is probably what people think of as the second train station, and it may be the first, that one that we just saw a few minutes ago, simply gussied up probably in the 1880s. If you look carefully at this window here, it looks very much like the 1860s windows in the first one. So I think this is, if this were today, leaving out the maintenance issues that you see here later in 1950, but it would have probably been sort of a rehabilitation of the station in the 80s from the 1860s. And this tower would have been added, and probably it was a fellow named Charles S. Frost who was doing that already for the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, which was by that time the main railroad, the railroad going along that line. They never threw anything out in the old days in Chicago, and so in Lake Forest, so this had gotten moved to where, just to the north of the City Hall, and was a police garage in 1950. Obviously they had maintenance issues. It looks like a child's garden of deferred maintenance. So, next slide please. This is Charles Frost. Charles Frost was from Maine, born in Maine, Lewiston, Maine. His father, I think, was a contractor there. He went to MIT, which was the early first American architectural school, studied, went into a firm called Peabody and Stern in Boston, learned all about architectural work. Another guy from the firm who had a brother who lived out in Chicago got a gig doing a club called the Union Club, Henry Ives Cobb, and he contacted Frost, who I think knew a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of architecture, and asked him if he would come out.
They've been in the same team at Stern, Peabody and Stern.
Right, but Frost was a little older, had a little bit more background in it, and so he was invited to come out and join a firm. They practiced together from 1882 until 1888 or 89. And then they went on different directions. Cobb was taken over by some other clients who wanted this exclusive work. Next slide. Now, his father-in-law was Marvin Hewitt. Marvin Hewitt had started his career in railroading in the, that we know about, in the early 1860s. He was working with the Union Army on the IC Railroad, the Illinois Central Railroad South. And he played a major role in what really led to the North's victory in the Civil War, which was delivery of materiel and people at appropriate times to the battle sites. So they had the stuff being manufactured in the North and delivered it. And it was Grant who was working with, and Grant was proving this method in those early days when Hewitt was organizing. He was basically a kid. I think he was around 20 or less. When he was doing this, and was a very brilliant sort of railroad operator. He later jumped ship to the Chicago Northwestern Railroad and built that system and took it out west. Next slide, please. Now this shows the little empire going up here, and his son-in-law Frost very quickly started helping him build railroad stations at all these places. As the communities grew, as business picked up, as the flow between Chicago back and forth to the little towns grew, each station needed a nice-looking railroad station, and to make sure they got done right and on time, he had his son-in-law involved in it. Next slide, please. This shows the whole thing. It didn't actually reach directly in all these places to the West Coast, but they made friendly agreements with other railroads so that they could have, I think, the Overland Limited or some different trains that went clear across the continent. I don't think it was quite this straight of a route. They perhaps have kind of smoothed out some of the rough places in here, but basically it was a really continental scaled railroad. Next slide, please. Now this is a wonderful little picture of the station at Milwaukee, I think 1889 by Charles S. Frost. And you can see he did quite a nice job of the kind of mastering the Romanesque style and also with a nice big tower. This station is no longer there, but it was pretty prominent. This is a picture probably from the 1890s. Next slide. This is an 1880s built. This Shirley Paddock found this picture, as she did with the police garage picture earlier. Where's Shirley? Shirley. Back there. Okay. Shirley found this picture at the place formerly known as the Chicago Historical Society, and now it's the Chicago History Museum. And this is the old freight house. It used to be kind of opposite where the store formerly known as Don's and the Jewel are, kind of in that area. And it was a big amount of stuff coming in and out of town, and so that stuff would get dumped there. The passengers would get off at the little station with their baggage, but not real freight, furniture, other things that are being shipped. Next slide, please. Now, the big event that changed Lake Forest from being kind of focused on Lake Forest College and the old town plan that we saw earlier was the Ewensia Club. Now, the house had been built by Frost's former partner, Henry Ives Cobb, as a house west of Green Bay Road, a little bit south of the community. And it was the biggest house in town when it was built from 1890 to 1893, when he had so many jobs he didn't know where to put all of his money probably. And as many architects, he probably figured maybe someone would want to buy it someday. So he built this huge house, and sure enough, before long, the Golf Course Club, which had started informally in 1892 in East Lake Forest on Forest Park, by 1894 had organized as the Lake Forest Golf Club and had moved to where the day school is now on borrowed property, Leander McCormick's property, decided to buy their own farm. They bought Cobb's farm and set up shop there, expanded gradually out in this direction. This was the original house here, and built more things as they went along. This would be a picture around in the 1910s, I would think. And that building was there until 1928 when the current building replaced it. Next slide. It generated a lot of, the Ewensia Club had generated a lot of traffic, and that led to a big change in the way the town was perceived and how what people took the railroads for. In that same period, another one of, Mr. Hewitt had 3 daughters. Another one of the daughters, and he bought a big property in the mid-90s in Lake Forest after the golf club went in. A former estate, the Canfield Estate, on the northeast corner of Westminster and Sheridan. And one of his other son-in-laws was named Granger, Alfred Granger, who had also gone to MIT. And both he and Cobb built houses on this new estate that they had. And there was another house for the third son-in-law who ran the passenger department of the railroad. Mr. Hewitt liked to keep things in the family. So Alfred Granger was a very dignified guy. His education was added on to by going and studying at the École des Beaux-Arts in the around 1890 or so, and then he also worked in Chicago. He was in William LeBaron Jennings' office at the same time Howard Shaw was. Next slide, please. This is Frost's own house, and Mrs. Haberle's here, I think, someplace. Yes, there we go. Here's a picture of her house, which is still preserved. Eastover, we're not showing Westover, which was the passenger guy's house, which is just a little bit west of that. And then the next slide shows Alfred Granger's house. They're different in style. Certainly the Frost house is very colonial Georgian in style. This shows a different later impulse, different impulse entirely. Combination of Queen Anne, half-timbered, and maybe a beginnings of the aesthetic movement on the front here, but with all Gothic things. But you can recognize features that show up in other buildings like City Hall later that Granger was in 1899 also. Okay, next slide. This is the 1899 no longer extant Alice Home Hospital on the Lake Forest College grounds. Notice the half timbering, and notice the hipped gable at the end of at the ends of each end of the building. That was turned on in the 60s. I think it was classified officially as kind of a fire trap by them, unfortunately. Next slide, please. This is Lois Durand Hall, built in 1899, also facing that other building. It's much more powerful. in terms of materials, that it has lasted to the present. It's been remodeled a few times, but it's still very much there. Next slide, please. This is what really started to draw people, starting in 1900. The horse shows. From 1900 to 1970, in late June every year, the Unwencia Club had monster-sized horse shows. They would have as many as 15,000 people showing up at those by the teens. This is around 1908 or so. Next slide. And that led to the need for a bigger and more substantial train station. The notes that I have from Gail Hodges tell me that to build this station, it wasn't just that it happened to be by coincidence the station of the chairman of the board of the railroad and his two architects, by coincidence, but actually she says that there were actually contributions from citizens to build this. That is an information that I've known before, but it's certainly consistent with everything. Certainly Shirley and I have learned about everything in Lake Forest. It was always a bunch of people banding together and putting in private money to make something happen. So that's great if it's true, and I think it probably is true. The railroad would not have justified that in terms of profits, probably. This is thanks to David Mattoon, who's here, who cataloged these recently for the Lake Forest Historical Society. They made some copies of this for us to be able to use. In part of their railroad exhibit, which is open this afternoon, if anybody hasn't seen it, the Historical Society for the Chicago Northwestern made available the original plans of the station. And so they're here. You can see this is a layout from south to north. This is it says women's waiting room, men's waiting room, the office with a little bump out so that you can see if the train's coming or not, or why it isn't coming. The entrance over here, and then baggage area over this way. That's what's interesting is there's a stairway here down, and Mr. Stevenson has helped us remember that, and David Mattoon has mentioned this also, that there was a tunnel underneath the tracks. And you could go underneath the tracks, which there's a certain logic to that, weather-wise and also safety-wise. But about 1970, I think David told me that was sealed up. Next slide, please. This is a glass negative that belongs to Shirley, showing the train, another view of that train. And you'll notice the landscape character of what the space was before and the kind of little drive in front of it. And the long train shed. The train shed won't quit. Very long. Next slide, please. This shows the end of it with the hipped gable. And notice these little pillars that are here. Those got truncated at some point before I got to town in the early 70s. Next slide, please. And that's a drawing of that little effect that's no longer there. There are wonderful I-beam things holding that, not I-beam, but iron posts that are holding that all up. Thank you. Next slide. This is to show another feature, shows those ends again, but look at here, the little tower, little watchtower that was there, signal tower, no longer there. Next slide. Another plan. This shows the station on the other side. And all it is basically someplace to come up out of the stairs and wait, with a little baggage room also. I guess they didn't picture people going north. Why would anyone go north? Chicago is south. Next slide. This is a picture from about the 60s from the college's files. But notice this little rounded bay window, which is where the train guy could stick his head to see if anything good was happening in either direction. Next slide. This is a very early slide before 1904 when the Anderson building, the Walgreens building went up. It shows over here, you can just see a little bit of the Blackler building that was already there. So this is what the station looked like from the north in the early days. This is a stereopticon view. Next slide, please. Now this is just a station to make the point that Frost and Granger not only did the C&NW stations, but they did it for other people. So they used the same basic pattern that we saw in the plans. This happens to be DeKalb, Illinois, but the tower is very Frost-like, kind of like City Hall's tower. City Hall had a tower like that originally. It got changed at some point. But that shows the kind of things. Now here's an example of another one in the next slide. This is an article from a magazine about the Sioux line. Frost and Granger did, and this is part one of a two-part article, practically a book, about all the stations that were done following a basic plan that was provided by Frost and Granger for their stations. And again, pictures of Frost and Granger, and they actually came from the college library collection too. Next slide. This shows the, what they were doing around the same time. This would have been the year before they did the station. Planned the station in 1900, built it in 1901. Planned in 1899, completed in 1900, was the Lake Forest College Chapel. And you can see features that were typical of both architects. The crenellations are kind of a clear, that was kind of a signature thing for Frost. These kind of balusters, I think those are kind of, the pillars, the supports, that's probably more Granger, I think. But that building was being done around the same time. Next slide. 1902, Frost did this very simple, no-nonsense, down Main, down Easterner Winter Club building that still looks like that. People know that on Sheridan Road. Next slide. Granger, at the same time, 1902, was doing this nice, modestly scaled church, Episcopal Church of the Holy Spirit on Westminster. Next slide. This house he did in 1903 for Harry Durand, son of Calvin Durand. Notice the half timbering continuing very much, I think that's pretty much a Granger design element. And that house still looks essentially like that today. Next slide. This house isn't here anymore. It's 1906, built for Mark Skinner. I think he went downhill in the panic of 1907, and it was owned by the Dangler family after that by 1909. It was owned by the Dangler family. Marvelous big place on the lake, torn down way back, probably in the 50s or so. Too big, too bad, sad. Next slide. This is the old South Street Station in Chicago. Frost and Granger did that. They did big stations as well as little stations. Next slide. This is the old Chicago and Northwestern station that they built in 1911. What's still there is what's on the far right, which is the Ogilvy Transportation Center, which you can still see has very much classical patterns to it, but the Roman bath main building is toast. That's gone. And in the 80s, for the Helmut Jahn building that's there now. Next slide. Frost later, working on his own still, Frost and Granger were partners until about 1909. And then Frost later was on his own, did Navy Pier. This end feature out here, that was based on the 1878 Paris Trocadero that was torn down around 1930, I think. But it was a World's Fair feature then, and it included in part of the Burnham and Bennett plan of 1909 was to have a big pier out here, and so it got implemented less than a decade later. Thank you. Next slide. This is back to Lake Forest. I think this is one of the college's mid-1950s homecoming events. And again, it just shows what the station looked like. For about 50 years, it was pretty much not too much changed. Here are those original ends of the train sheds. Next slide, please. This is just a bus for Lake Forest College, but it shows the station in the background, same feature. Next slide. Winter view, same features. Yeah, same snow we have right now. Oh, no, it's gone, it's gone. Next slide. This is a train whizzing by in probably the 70s. And notice that the paint, the half timbering is painted white up above. And you can see the colors of the old, well, you can see what the shades of the old Northwestern commuter trains. Next slide, please. This was a slide, and it only shows that these have been truncated by the, probably around the 70s. And these are some students standing on the platform waiting, but now it's flat-ended, it's been cut back. Next slide. More cut back. And you can tell by the cars, it's about that same 70s era or something like that. Next slide. This is after it's restored in the early 80s. This is an artist's rendering, and it shows the way it pretty much looks today. This little gizmo here, that little visible signal was there. Semaphore signal, right, yes. Next slide then. And this is the final slide of my group, and it's simply to show Alice Moulton Ely's nice drawing of the station as it was when the renovation was completed in the early 80s. So thank you very much for those slides. And I'll just say a few words about the history of, make a few bullet points about what was really going on with the restoration project. For most of the railroads, the passenger train era ended in the late 60s. A great number of the great trains all came to a halt in 1968. Stations started falling down in the city or being taken down. The Grand Central Station, which was a C&O, B&O, the IC Station, which used to be on the south side of Grant Park, these all kind of went by the wayside in that period. The railroads were they were being funded partially. Their commuter functions were sort of not yet quite stabilized under public money. And there's a wonderful anecdote of how they used to clean the station in Lake Forest, the railroad, the Chicago Northwestern. When the train would pull into the station, the crew would fly off of the train with a bucket and a mop. They would go into the station, whisk around the station, and get back on before it left. That's very efficient. So there were some issues about the station in that period. Definitely some issues, and the community people, again, who'd originally helped contribute to building the station, came forward to say that we should be doing something. And so it was the first real major project for the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation around 1980 to undertake restoring the station. It was a partnership agreement that pulled together the city, the railroads, the evolving regional transit powers that be, and the foundation to raise the money. Is about $400,000 was raised to make it possible to bring the station, to adaptively reuse it for a series of different kinds of business uses, and to make it look again like a good station. What's significant about this is this was the first North Shore such project. What it led to is it triggered a whole thing, dominoes up and down the line of nicer stations or beefed up stations. Some places where old ones had been torn down, they were replaced, that sort of thing. And so this was the trend setter, ours was. Let's see, first North Shore Station. Oh, and it won an award, Richard Driehaus Award, from Landmarks Preservation Organization in Chicago of Illinois, LPCI at that time, and did win an award for that, and it was a very high-profile event and made a big difference. So I think that I've made most of the points. These are the points that Gail Hodges pointed out, and I'm thanking her for having made that available. Without further ado, because I think we're going to go on to continue with slides, I will introduce our preservation architect, who's going to give us some observations on having visited the station and seeing it from his point of view.
Thank you. I'm going to start just with a little bit of background about who I am. So why would you want to listen to me, I guess? My name's Gunny Harboe. I'm a preservation architect in Chicago, where I've been practicing about 20 years. And was happy to come up and take a look at the station last week. And I'm going to show you a little bit about my background and the kinds of things we do, and then talk a little bit about what I saw in that hour walk around and what potential things are there. As I said, about 20 years ago, I grew up in Northfield. And in fact, on a personal note, my parents, who are in their 80s now, actually met and fell in love in Lake Forest back almost 60 years ago. And the train station became kind of a point of meeting for them, because my mother had a cousin who lived up here, and my father was actually staying up here with a professor on the Lake Forest campus. And so they would often meet at the station, which they were telling me about the other day. So that's kind of a nice thing. Anyway, I grew up in Northfield, got overeducated out east. I went to Brown University, and then I got a master's degree in preservation from Columbia, New York, and then I got a master's at MIT in Boston. Came back here in 1988 and had the great fortune of getting a job with a brand new firm called McClear at that time, which was a design build firm. And the first big project I got to work on was the Rookery. And I spent almost 4 years on that project. I was pretty much the only one in the office who understood the detail about what preservation work was about. So even as a young Turk, I got assigned to that job and basically loved it for almost the full 4 years. That project then led to the Reliance Building conversion. Well, actually, first we restored the outside of it, and then it was converted to the Hotel Burnham, and we actually worked on both of those sections. This is showing what it looked like before and then the after pictures. I'm assuming that most of you are aware of that building. It's kitty corner from Marshall Fields on the corner of Washington and State Street. That has led to other things. A lot of these are the early Chicago skyscrapers. This is the Marquette Building, where we put the cornice back on that had been removed in the 1940s, and this is also where we office now. The MacArthur Foundation is our landlord, and we have a very good working relationship with them. We do a lot of little projects on the building, and we love being on the second floor. We can look out over the Dearborn there. This is another project that we did sort of at McClear, and then 2 years ago I left McClear to start my own firm, Harboe Architects, and this is one of the projects that was sort of a transition project, starting with McClear and going on my own with a firm called Crick and Sexton Architects that are very well known for their contemporary architecture. They recently completed the Spertus Museum on Michigan Avenue, very contemporary, modern building. And here we were restoring Mies van der Rohe's famous Crown Hall, and the idea is that that's the original picture. That's how it looks now. I'm not giving you lectures on these things, but there was certainly a lot of decrepitness that had crept in the meantime. Chicago Board of Trade is another project that we did. Again, sort of a transition project. Started with McClear, finished with Harboe Architects, and there we were charged with restoring the main lobby there, which architecturally was all there, but really it was a matter of the finishes and the lighting, which was had been altered, in fact, completely removed. And this is a project that's been going on for about 5 years. It's the old Carson Pirie Scott store on State Street. In fact, this is where my mother was working when she used to come up to Lake Forest. As many of you may remember, the picture on the right is how it looked since the late 1940s, that had the cornice removed. You can see here is the original building with sort of a recessed loggia at the very top. This is one of Louis Sullivan's most famous buildings. And it was bought by a developer about 5 or 6 years ago, and they got some money from the city to restore the cornice. And this shows you the historic image. That's what it looked like before we got started. Next, again, the historic, and that's what it looks like today. So our job was to bring it back to what it had been originally. So there's the historic, the before and the after, and we feel like we got it pretty close. That was a very long, it took about 2 years. It was very involved trying to get the ornament right, because as most of you, I assume, know that Louis Sullivan was very much about the organic ornament. That was his whole sort of thing. And we had no original historic fabric to replicate this from, so we had to use photographs, and working with a guy named Tim Samuelson, who's the cultural historian for the city of Chicago, a fantastic fountain of knowledge about everything in Chicago, but particularly Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright, who he's one of the leading scholars in the world on those two. And he worked very closely with us to get that correct. Now we are engaged in dealing with the 2-story cast iron storefront. Another very signature thing of Sullivan. It has lost a lot of its ornament over the years, and unfortunately there's not enough, even with the $10 million that's going to get spent on this now, it's not enough money to actually put all the gewgaw back, as we call it. There's big wreaths and all kinds of extra things that were eliminated over the years. Next. But I don't know how well you can see this, but you can see pieces are beginning to come off. You see some of the corrosion that's taken place. And basically, now that we've started to disassemble this thing, everyone is amazed that it's been up there as long as it has, because it was basically ready to fall off. You can see the level of corrosion that's gone on. And so this entire 2-story high, it's almost 40 feet high, cast iron assembly that wraps the whole building is going to be completely disassembled, taken off-site. All the paint will be stripped, it'll be restored in a shop, and then brought back and reassembled on the building, supposedly all by the end of '09. This is one of the tools that preservation architects use very often, and that is finish analysis. And as you can see, these are called stratigraphies. This is kind of like an archaeological dig, only it's just the surface of the building in order to try to determine the original paint color. And this was very important to get right and much discussed. In fact, there were 3 different analyses done to get back to what the original color was. So we're very confident that when we repaint it now, it'll be the right color green. It always was a green. It was supposed to look like bronze. In addition to that, this is the backside of Carson's, and this is along Wabash. This building here and this building there, that you see in the blow up there, have been quite altered. You can see that the parapet had been torn off and had been painted and so on, and now we're in the process. Both of these projects are in construction right now. They're both going to be restored. This is the Baker Atwater, Haskell Atwater buildings, early post-fire buildings, 1870s, very significant City of Chicago landmarks. Basically everything I've shown you are all City of Chicago landmarks. And one of the fun things is that this is actually, we're not putting the bridge back. This was a bridge that connected the L to Carson's. But the rendering on the right shows the building that Louis Sullivan had designed with the idea in mind of connecting to the L. And in fact, this was done just before the full building was done. So some of his ideas were sort of tested out. And some of the pieces of it around the first 2 floors, you see it here, those were in fact built and those will be restored. Here you see kind of some of the fragments, and this all exists as well underneath this storefront. So that's going to be peeled off and then restored. More Mies van der Rohe, we have developed quite an expertise in preserving modernism and feel that recent past is often sort of a hard one for people to get their arms around and love, but nonetheless it's very important culturally, especially for this city where we pride ourselves on the architecture legacy, and Mies van der Rohe is one of those most important pieces. This is 860, 880 Lakeshore Drive. Again, with Crick and Sexton, we're working with them, and this was dealing with a very elaborate paint job. You can see some of the surface corrosion there. This also had work done about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. It's about the cycle. Here are some mock-ups that we're doing to make sure that we're getting it correct. And the other big piece of this project is the plaza. This is the travertine stone plaza. And I like to joke with people, there was a famous axiom that is attributed to Mies, although he never said it, which is less is more, meaning to minimize things down to the very finest detail. And unfortunately, less was not always enough, because the way that he detailed these things have led to great problems, both for just the way the building performs, and in particular, when you have a dead, flat plaza in this climate made out of that material, it's going to have problems, and you can see the kinds of failure that they've had. And they've actually worked on this in a major way a couple of times. Now the whole thing has to be taken up, the concrete has to be repaired underneath it, new waterproofing, etc. It's not a very glamorous project, but very needed and fundamental for the survival of the building. You can see kind of what happens when you put something dead flat. It doesn't really drain very well. We're also going to be working on the storefront system, which was completely replaced in the 1980s, and we were looking at restoring it back to the original, but the budget doesn't hold that much money for it. So basically, this is Annie Mae Swift Hall at Northwestern University, the second oldest building on the campus, I believe, built in the early 1890s. But in the auditorium it did. This is a before, and that's what it looks like now. This is in progress right now, being construction. So another campus project. At IIT, we're not only working on the Mies buildings, but this is the old main building, the one you see from the Dan Ryan as you go south. And this was the Armour Institute building that was the building on the campus. It's a really beautiful building, but it's suffered from neglect for a long, long time. It also had a fire, many of these buildings did, and it lost the top peak of the roof. Right now we are investigating the possibilities of putting back the original roof, as well as a major exterior restoration that's needed on the masonry. And this is another project that we've been working on about 5 years, and it keeps going on forever. And that's okay, because it's one of the great buildings in the world, in my opinion. That's Unity Temple in Oak Park by Frank Lloyd Wright. And it has all kinds of issues. They need lots of money, and they just sort of do things in a little bit at a time when they can do it. And the connection is that most of these projects that I just described often have a study done at the very beginning in order to fully understand what you have. And it ties in the historic information, as well as an understanding of the change over time, so you can really begin to make decisions about intervention into a landmark building that makes sense for what we need today, as well as trying to have it provide a demonstration of its significance. A lot of it depends on its period of significance, what you're trying to restore it to, etc. But these are examples of the kinds of studies that get done on significant historic properties. This is a preservation master plan for Unity Temple, and then that sort of sets the tone. That's something that you can then look back to and follow through on a project that might take 5 or 10 years. This is the Fort Knightley in Chicago, McKim Eden White designed building on Bellevue that has also served them well, sort of a master planning document. Crown Hall I mentioned before. This was volume 1 of the 3-volume set on the Reliance building. That was a thing about this thick that we did for the city before any work was done. And the lower right, that's the main building master plan. And that one was started because we got called in to help them renovate the elevators. The elevators needed to be upgraded, and there's no toilet rooms in there that are ADA accessible for the American with Disabilities Act. And they said, can you just come in and give us some bathrooms and fix the elevator? And I said, well, yes, we can, but experience tells us as soon as we start scratching and you pull on that loose thread, before you know it, the whole thing is unraveling. And rather than get surprised by that, we should really take a holistic view, understand the building, and make plans accordingly, because we knew they didn't have enough money to do the major restoration of the building, although they would love to be able to do it if someone would write them a big check. Unfortunately, that wasn't happening. But the master plan, interestingly enough, has already instigated some major fund contributing, or some contributions, and that's why we're starting to look at this roof project now, which wasn't in the plan 2 years ago. I mean, we described what would have to happen for it, but it wasn't in their budget. So the point here is that oftentimes this kind of a planning document is a very good tool so that everyone can get an understanding of where you are and where you need to go, and use that as the roadmap, so to speak. So that brings us to your building, which is really a beautiful building. This is on the east side, and I hadn't seen the historic images until today, and they're very telling, and there's a lot of information there. And you can see that basically it has its same form, but there have been quite a few little changes, and much of that might have to do with some of the finishes and the way it was treated, perhaps in the last restoration or maybe even before. Next. It has a lot of nice detailing. It seems to be original. I don't know how well you can see this, but some of this woodwork and so on is quite beautiful. And then, of course, it's in dire need of a paint job. And I don't know whether it's been painted since the last renovation. It could be that it hasn't, and you can really only expect 7 to 10 years out of a paint job, as probably most of you know from your own homes. So to expect it to go 20 years is asking it to be a little bit much. And you can see some of the problems that occur when you don't maintain it. You get rot. There's some more of it here. I don't know, again, that the light in here is a little bright, but you can see perhaps there where the end of these rafter tails have begun to deteriorate to the point where they're losing historic fabric. And again, walking around, it was clear that there had been work on the masonry, and what the slide on the right indicates is that perhaps the original mortar color was a red color as opposed to this white color. And this wasn't done very well in the sense that it's kind of smeared over the joints and making it not only a little bit messy, but also gives a very different appearance when you look at the building as a whole, rather than red brick with a dark joint, sort of giving it a more of that late turn of the century kind of a look. It has this sort of more New England-y colonial look with the light mortar joints in the red brick. Here again, you see some of the paint deterioration. I mean, basically structurally, it looks very sound, so that's a good thing. A lot of the repairs that are needed are cosmetic, and I'm also assuming that a large part of the budget is to bring up all the building systems to current need, and that would be a major cost impact. You see the windows are look to be the original windows, and in pretty good shape other than needing some TLC. The big thing is the roof. This building, when you look at it from a distance or even up close, it's pretty much all about the roof. That's the main image that you get when you look at it, and it's not even like it used to be when it had those longer sheds that extended. It was really sort of a beautiful relationship of these different roofs. And you can begin to see that some of this roofing is probably served its full life. You can see here that the weathering on the shingles is showing that it's probably about time to be replaced. And I'm not sure if they're suffering from any leaks yet, but it probably won't be too long until it is. And my understanding is that the original roof was a slate roof. Is that correct? So one would think about, in replacing this roof, to go back to the slate if that could be budgeted to do so. Inside, this would be part of what the study would show, and I know that there's probably good documentation of what was done in the last renovation, but it would be interesting to know what's in there, what's original, what's not, to be able to treat those things accordingly. One of the questions is, now that the bank is moving out, what's going to go in there, what wants to go in there, what kind of program needs to be built in to support in that building, both in the west building and the east building. And all those kinds of questions would want to get answered before you sort of intervene in a major way. This is the ticket booth, and that's where the bank space was, the former women's ladies' waiting room. And then this is the west building, which we didn't get into, but basically from the outside it had similar issues to what was visible on the main building on the east side of the tracks. So that's what I saw. It's a fantastic building, and it certainly has great bones, and it's really pretty sound, but it does need a lot of work in the sense that to restore it or just to preserve it in the way that it is, it would still require quite a bit of work to get it to be in top shape, so to speak. And that's my observation. Yeah, Jack?
Of an HSR in terms of fundraising and supporting documents for grants.
Yeah, it not only is it a great tool just to be able to make good decisions about the building, and that's really the primary reason to do it, but on several of our projects, it's proven to be a really good fundraiser. Unity Temple uses theirs for that. As I mentioned, IIT has found that when they bring in alumni who might be interested in donating, they have actually document here, see how fantastic this building was, this is what we'd really like to do, wouldn't it be great if you could help us do that? And it depends on the formatting of it and so on, and of course the primary purpose of the Historic Structure Report is to provide a tool for that planning, but it can also be edited and or repackaged in different ways, or just as it is, in order to make it something that is sort of a prettier version, if you will, that can then serve as a way to go out and fundraise with it, and that's been done a lot. It also, if you're looking for grants, sometimes the bodies that give the grant, whether it's a National Trust, I don't know that this would qualify for a Getty grant, I don't think so, but on other projects where we have, for example, Crown Hall got a Getty grant, the HSR was a prerequisite in order to get the grant. So it shows the grant givers that you are serious about your building and that you've done your homework and you understand your building and you're looking to do the right thing by that building.
It seems to me from the presentation that there have been a number of different permutations of this building. So if you were to do an historic restoration of it, what aspects do you think would be worth restoring back to one of those earlier versions?
Well, that would be the question, for sure, and that's why that kind of a study is critical, because in order to answer the question with intelligence, you need to understand what it is you're looking at. I mean, we can see from those pictures and this picture that there's been change, but we don't understand the change. At least I don't. Maybe there's others here that feel they do, but I think The purpose of the HSR, Historic Structure Report, is to document the change and understand why it changed, when it changed, and to really sort of see it in its whole context, and then to make decisions about, okay, it's 2008, 2010, whatever year now you want to pick. How do we move forward? What do we want to restore it to? You know, do you want to put the hipped gable back on it, on the sheds? Do you want to extend the sheds? Do you want to put back? You can't afford the slate roof. Do you go back with a shingle roof? You know, all those kinds of questions that you want to make with the best amount of information that you can have it at hand in order to make the right decision, or what is as good a decision as you can make. Ultimately, there's going to be compromises. It's not 1901 anymore. It's 2008. So there are different, you know, demands and requirements on the building. You're going to want to heat and cool the building in a different way than it was, et cetera. So.
So in 1901, you would have 10 minutes between each train. Now, it's an hour. So you had quite a bit more traffic 100 years ago. Different.
See what we could do to help get the story straightened out and get as much participation as we could from different people about different opinions and background and information about all these different things. Mr. Mayor just mentioned that the little tunnel is still there, and that do we want to say it on TV, though? We maybe don't.
Well,
No?
it's the one time I ever get to correct you, Art. I mean,
There we go. No, go ahead.
Once in a lifetime. The tunnel is still there. When you go to the tree lighting ceremony, he is standing underneath me. And when you start with the 10, he runs up the tunnel to turn on the lights in City Hall and the bottom of the train stations. The tunnel is still there.
So it isn't Santa Claus that does it. Okay, good.
What if you could just spend a few minutes talking about the relationship of this building in the context of Market Square?
Yes, that got rushed past, and it's very important.
As a total.
Market Square has 4 sides, not 3 sides. The original side was the train station, 1901. 1912, the Lake Forest Improvement Trust purchased the land along Western Avenue where Market Square now is. They bought that in about a week before everybody could figure out why they were buying it. And they gathered that package together. They went through 3 plans of how to do their plan. And they finally came up with one that would allow Market Square to be commercially supported, which was with a long, deep square. The architecture then cued off of that, which was on the east side of the square. It also cued off of the City Hall, which Frost & Granger had built, which is to the southwest of the square. And there was a little city building that Frost & Granger had built that's now sort of where Southgate is. Southgate's nucleus was there already. And there was a building on the north of the square. Shirley knows about this. There's a small building that has Einstein's in it now that has very similar features, Tudor features, and that I'm almost certain is a Frost & Granger building also. So it was this context in which then Shaw and his staff developed the plan for the square. Those were their boundaries, that was their context, and very much reflecting architecturally the ideas that first show up in City Hall, 1899, and in this building in 1901. Market Square was the first commercially driven City Beautiful Town Center. It was the first City Beautiful Town Center designed around motor vehicles. It was the first shopping mall, in effect. I didn't invent those terms. That's all out of a book in 1997 by Richard Longstreth, an architectural historian, who sorted this all out in relation to the development of malls across the country. It was published in articles. People from Florida came up here from Meisner's work in Palm Beach and copied it for the work they were doing down there. Not copied, picked up the best ideas and used them in their plans. And people are still building market squares around the country today. So this being an integral part of Market Square, and one that's owned by the city, is very much something that everybody's interested in making sure happens. So it's part of one of the most important architectural innovations in the 20th century, and has a great deal of architectural significance. Thank you for bringing that up. David?
I just want to say that those plans were donated by Joe Pearson from the Chicago Northwestern Historical Society. Who's in the yellow check shirt.
Oh, Joe, all right, there we go. Hello, thank you very much. We appreciate having them so we can include them in the show. Good.
We have other things that might be interesting.
Oh, great, okay. So in other words, this gathering this sort of material together, that's part of what goes into doing a historic structure survey. First, get as much as we can as the original historic information, and then start working from there. Yes, Ron, one last thing.
I was wondering how the electric, North Shoreline electric station, which was done by Peter Weber, how that fit in, and would it be conceivable that, its design could be, returned and made functional as part of an overall?
It could be Whitehall. It could be Whitehall reconstructed. We just need a donor. It could be Ron Whitehall. It would need, you can do anything if you have a will of the people.
Is there any economic advantage or support, or something like
It's something that could be talked about and thought through, certainly it was a handsome building. It disappeared in the period when a lot of handsome buildings were disappearing. It lost its function in 1955 when the North Shoreline, this lakeshore side, stopped running, and so I'm sure the clock started ticking right then on that building. So thank you very much, everyone. Oh, certainly, yes.
I'm sitting here, I'm thinking. There's a captive audience here. People are very interested in this building and may, in the attic somewhere, have pictures of it,
Yes.
which you may think are insignificant, but which actually may be significant. So if any of you and or anyone you know may have snapshots from the 40s, 50s, 60s, or whenever, that show the station or any part of the station, like some of those images you showed were kind of just, here's a slide of students, Okay, well, there may be some information in there that doesn't show up in any other image that might actually prove to be of some significance to understanding the whole story. So anyway, if you have those images, please bring them forward and get them scanned. Now with this technology, it's very easy to scan things.
You don't have to give up your pictures.
And you might be, making that contribution in that way, which would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you very much. So I think our hour is up, and thank you very much all for coming.